This and all talks at the 2019 JavaScript for WordPress Conference are brought to you in part by our sponsors Pantheon, a high-performance hosting platform with agile developer tools. Check them out at pantheon.io.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining us in this last talk of the Gutenberg track of the JavaScript for WordPress conference. I'm joined here by Josh Pollock, and I will introduce him in a second. Josh Pollock is the founder and lead developer at Caldera WP, creator of Caldera Forms, drag and drop responsive form builder for WordPress. He's also a WordPress core contributor and the author of 2 books about WordPress development. And with that, I will hand it over to you, and good luck on the talk.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you, Zach, for inviting me to speak, and everybody who's watched. I've had such a good time jumping through these talks today and learning new things. My talk is about JavaScript testing in and around WordPress. We'll get into what that means and why I called it that in a second. A little bit about me. My name again is Josh, and I'm a JavaScript and PHP engineer at Caldera WP. I'm also the founder, a business owner, or whatever, but the fun stuff is writing code and writing tests for code. So that's what we're talking about today. I get to work, we're in the process of bringing a lot of the stuff into React and bringing from Caldera Forms and working on new things using frameworks like Vue and Laravel and React. This talk, definitely something where you're going to want to look at the example code for, and also steal this example code. So these slides right here, that's a short link at the top, and I just put it, it's on my Twitter, it's in this Slack here. I definitely recommend that following along. And then also, steal from there. It's helpful stuff. You can get the source code for these slides is also on GitHub. So this will probably appear at other WordCamps in the future. And if you want to help out, fix a typo or whatever, put in a pull request in any of this. And there's a blog post there where I talked a little bit about that, which I wrote this morning. So let's jump in. The first thing that we need to talk about is the types of testing. And this is generic to any type of web application development, I would say. It doesn't have anything to do with JavaScript. It's just there are different types of tests, and they each have their strengths and weaknesses, and they tell us things about our code. They can't tell us anything, everything. They can tell us some things. So we have unit tests. These tell us if our test just like one piece of functionality. So in PHP, that's generally a class, or if you have a React component, that's one React component. The smallest unit, no dependencies, anything else is mocked. We just want to check, does this one thing work? That has its strength of telling you, does the thing work? It has a weakness of, it doesn't tell you if it works with anything else. So that's when we start to get into the integration tests. Laravel tends to call these feature tests, and I really like that. This idea of you test your classes individually in unit tests, and then your feature tests are, do all these units that comprise one feature work correctly together? So I like that terminology. And we also have acceptance tests or end-to-end tests. And this is when instead of simulating the environment, instead of isolating everything, we go right ahead and make everything, do it in a real setting. So we use headless Chrome, headless Firefox, or if you're doing like desktop application development, you would run through and run the desktop application or the mobile app in an emulator like Xcode or Android Studio. So we're going to look at that because they answer all these different questions, and together they give us confidence about our code. So the first part of this is testing React apps. The second part is testing WordPress React. And the concepts are very similar. I think it's very great that WordPress has these transferable skills now that we learn about React and we can use in other places. Also, it's just easier to learn it without having to worry about WordPress right away. So I do want to back up and talk a little bit about how React works. Put everything in context, pun intended, for what we're talking about. I like to think of React as this 2-step process. There's a lot of stuff that you can do with JSX and classes and all of this. At the end of it, you look down at what it's actually compiling to. It's doing react.createElement or wp.createElement inside of the WordPress editor. And so this function, it doesn't actually create HTML. It doesn't create a string to put on the page. What it does is add to this tree that represents the DOM a class, which is a div and has this class and this inner HTML. So that's just an object that represents what the DOM would be. And then your step 2 is that you render it. That's a renderer. So that converts that object to a usable interface. So one example is React DOM. React DOM.render, we pass it that React component or component tree, and we pass it a DOM element, and it makes an interactive app on that element. React DOM server, which is a Node.js library that you run on your server to render React components and send them back over HTTP requests, that just has a rendered string. So it just creates an HTML string, a string of HTML. So we could also build a renderer for other things. For example, Ink is designed for console apps or the test renderers. This is a special type of renderer for React that is designed to only be useful for testing. Like the output of this is not useful really in any other thing, but it gives you, an object that you can inspect, and we can look at it, and we can do assertions, tests based on these. So there's a few of these out there. The 3 most important ones to know about are React Test Renderer. This is the one that was developed by Facebook. It's very basic. It's good for snapshots, which we'll get into. It's not great for integration tests. It's good for unit tests because it doesn't simulate anything about the DOM really. JS DOM is a library that Enzyme and React Testing Library do use, where they simulate a DOM, the web API in JavaScript. That's useful for a lot of things like pre-rendering or, say, pretending to be an interface that you're rendering to. So Enzyme and React Testing Library give you the ability to render to JS DOM, inspect the results. We'll look at some of that. And also, fire events, native browser events, simulated native browser events to make sure your code reacts correctly. And so this is a lot of stuff. I found it super confusing when I got into JavaScript testing because I was used to PHP testing where PHP unit basically does everything for you. And in JavaScript, it's JavaScript. So you install 12 packages and they each install 20 more packages. And so sometimes it can be confusing to see all these parts and understand them and get the terms. So I wanted to make sure everybody had that. There's a test runner. It runs the tests. Jest is developed by Facebook. It's what we're using today. PHP unit's a test runner, and more. We already talked about test renderers. We'll need 1 or more of those. We can use React DOM as well. In fact, I'll show you how to do that in a second. And then we'll need to do assertions. We want to test that the output is what we expect it to be. Chai is probably the most popular assertion library for JavaScript. And there are a bunch of those out there. And there are alternatives to Jest. But we're going to use Jest because it's what WordPress uses and Create React Apps uses. React Scripts is a zero config testing build tool for React apps. When you start a React app, if you look in package.json, it has a script called test, and that's React Scripts test. React Scripts build the build. So WordPress has built a similar package inspired by React Scripts that's zero config, actually really extensible, way more than React Scripts. React Scripts is great, in my opinion, until it's not great. And you can eject. There are alternatives. But I really love the fact that WordPress Scripts out of the box just kind of works, and it's super extensible, which we'll see in the second half of this. So let's jump in. Let's build a web app. The example code is linked in the beginning. You want to jump back in my commit history. I did every step to the beginning to follow along here. Let's just walk through this. So to create an entire React app, you can do it in 1 line, npx create React app if you don't have Create React App installed locally, which I don't recommend. It's one of those things where you run it the most recent version with npx. And then it comes with 1 included test. So you just type yarn test into your console. Pretty neat. So it does have this included test. It's like 1 acceptance test. It tests if anything is broken. And I like starting here because there's not much to look at in this first example here. It just introduces the concepts. We import React DOM. We haven't even used a renderer yet. And we import this component to be tested. And then we use it exactly like we normally would. And if this fails, something is wrong. There is no specificity here. That is the strength. The weakness of an acceptance test and end-to-end test is we don't really know what went wrong, but we know something went wrong, so we can zoom in. So it's, this is a bit of a, wide test. And so going over our questions again, how do we know the components work? Each individual one, we use unit tests. How do we know they work together? We use integration tests. Then how do we get a realistic test of the program? How do we know that it'll be used correctly as the way that the user wants to use it? And that is something that acceptance tests can answer for us. And so this builds this pyramid. Ken C. Dodds, who's the author of React Testing Library, and I'll reference a few more times, has an article called The Pyramid, where he shows a graphic called The Pyramid of Testing. And each one of these are a layer that gives you more confidence. So we just want to keep asking questions of our code and figuring out how to answer them. So let's come up with the pretend specification for this app. This is a one-page app that displays a value and has an input to change that value. That's it. We just need that. How would I know that I have satisfied the specification for software? Well, I like test-driven development, where I first define my tests, and then before writing any code, I can work with the other people on my team, a client, whoever it is, to discuss whether or not those tests are, if they pass, would those represent success, or are they insufficient? So it makes the expectations for all the developers clear, and it also gives you the confidence of having tests. So let's look at the kind of questions we would want to answer. Does display component display the supplied value? Right? We are going to have a component that displays this. Does it work? Does it show what's passed to it? Does the edit component, right? That's going to be a text input control, but inputs have a value. We want to make sure that's the correct value. And when we give it an onChange callback function, and then we change the input, will it change with the right value? And then we're going to want to put the two components together and test, do they work together? I.e., when we have this, this component that shows the value and a component that shows an input to change it, and we type some stuff into the input, does it change in there, in the display? So we're going to have some test files, and by default, Jest will run any file in your source directory with a .test in it. There's a few other matches. You can have a __ test, so on and so forth. But I like to just have them in there. There's a few different syntaxes we can use here. So this is a testing file where I haven't added any tests yet. But here we're going to just start by importing React, importing the test renderer for React, and then we're going to import this component. And by the way, at this point, that doesn't do anything. It's literally just an empty component. It's going to generate error. But I like this syntax because it says test. We're testing component renders value. And so if that fails, I'll get a console message saying, failed to test component renders value. So it's meaningful. And so this test function does come from Jest in our test suite. We can do more involved tests of an entire set of functionality. Right, so this edit value component is a little bit more complex, so we might want to group test. So this is behavioral-driven development style. I really like this because we start to put into our code the expectations of the user. The user expects to see that value in the input. We're describing the component. It does this. It passes string to onChange when changed. We can start to write what the user expects into these tests, and then make sure that they accurately reflect how the user uses it. The other thing that we're doing here is we're using a mock function from Jest, and we're going to use this in place of a normal onChange function in our isolated tests, where this is a function that just tracks what was passed to it and how many times it was called. And because, right, these are all inside of the same closure here, on-chain share scope in here and in here, I'm going to use the before each callback inside of this. If you have a function called before each, it will run before each of these closures below it. There's also after each and a before that'll run once and an after that'll run once. Very semantic. So here, I just have before each that'll just reset this on change because it's a counter. It knows how many times it's called, and you'll see how that could be a problem if we didn't reset it like that. I have seen some people suggest that you shouldn't do this up here. You should just isolate them into each closure. There's some value to that. Different discussion. So we did need to use the React test renderer. So go ahead and install that if you don't have it already. This is all just coming from npm here. And so we want to talk about how do we unit test React components? How do we take these components, put them in an isolation, and just make sure they work? Here's one option, and don't do this, by the way. Right, I'm doing this to make a point. In this case, we're using test renderer.create to render our component. We're passing it a value, then we're like searching through the DOM tree that it renders to find the root, and then we're searching here, finding a div. Luckily, I only have one div, and we're just making sure that its children are this value. I have to do this for every single prop in order to get that kind of confidence. Also, that's testing how React works, not your application. And this is a key point of testing, is that your job isn't to test your dependencies. Your job is to test your code in isolation, unit test, and then how it works with your dependencies in integration and acceptance testing. So like writing tests like this would not only be boring and redundant and difficult to maintain, very brittle, it's also just unnecessary. Snapshot testing is way better. How snapshot testing works is it takes your component, it renders it to JSON and commits that to the file system. Then it runs it again, and if there's any differences, it shows that to you. So A, this tells us, did my props go to the right places? That is something I'm concerned about. You know, if I have a prop called outer class name and a prop called inner class name, I want to make sure that the outer class name goes on the class name argument of the outermost element and so on and so forth. So that is important to me. But more importantly, I want to know if anything changes, right? Like I'm going to run this when it's correct. And then if I change, that means that it's going to have to write a file change for that snapshot, which is therefore part of my Git history, which is going to show up in my GitHub pull request review. And other developers are going to have to look at it and say, Josh, why is this changing? There's no reason. Or, oh, the specification here was, you know, let's say that I've been assigned a task, a bug that is, you know, class name doesn't appear correctly. Hopefully there is a, you know, should have this class name. Before that ticket on GitHub looks good, there should be a change to that snapshot, you know, in that pull request that shows that that property has changed. Also, this is way easier with backup of you. Look at this mess. I can't make sense of that really. Look at this. This is much cleaner. And it's going to get cleaner in a minute. We're testing component renders correctly. Inside of expect, right? I'm expecting it to match snapshot. I use my component exactly like I would in real use. To JSON. That's it. That's literally the entire thing. And it is a lot of testing here because it covers my props, it covers changes against props. You know, this prevents regression errors better than anything I've ever seen. Huge fan of snapshot testing. It doesn't really, but it's static. This is the limitation of it. It's going to test that my unchanged property went to the right place. You know, got mapped to the right endpoint. Doesn't really tell me about what it does, right? That's an event, right? It's an unchanged event. And so we are going to need, as I said earlier, a test renderer and system that's set up for that better. Enzyme is what I used to use. React testing library got me because React hooks worked there first. Like Enzyme just aired out with any React hooks. I presume they fixed it by now. I just really like React testing library. It's a little bit of more of a learning curve than Enzyme. Like Enzyme, you select using jQuery-like lookups. And so it's just a different mental model. Like that's more developer focused, whereas React testing library is built around this idea of testing your code like users use it, which I think is important. So if we want to test an onChange event, let's walk through this in a few pieces. First, because I'll stop showing the imports in a minute, from testing library React, I'm going to import render. That's going to allow me to that runs the renderer. This cleanup function, which I'm going to call after each one, just reset the JS DOM, so that way each test doesn't have stuff left over. And then there's this function fire event, which fires synthetic events. We'll see that in a second. And so I just have 2 empty tests here. This one's call onChange function here. This next slide is that, we're going to put tests there. I just wanted to make sure it was visible. So again, we're going to use Jest onChange function. And our goal is to check, has it been called 1 time? So this function, again, it has an internal timer. It's jest.fn. So I'm going to render this edit value component. And this, I can deconstruct a bunch of different methods from the results that allow me to query against and find elements. This get by test ID, this component I happen to know has a data test ID attribute. That's the same as the ID. That's just in its design. You can see that if you go in the example code. So that will allow me to use get by test ID to select this element there, and then I can fire an event on it. What kind of event? Change event. If I wanted to fire a click event, I would put fire event.click. You can simulate submit events for forms, hover, that sort of thing. And I'm passing it an event object in the DOM or a synthetic event in React has a lot of things in it. But what's important to me here is it has an object called target, and target has a property called a value. So that's what I'm going to send it. And in this test, all I want to know is, does it actually call that onChange function? Which seems trivial, but if that breaks, everything else is going to go bad. Like there was a point where I was working on this example code where I couldn't get the thing to update, like my display component to update. And I was like, well, of course it's updating. And I went back to my test and I was clicking around in the browser and, that had failed. And so I went in and realized like I'd accidentally disconnected something while I was tinkering with something else. So this is a bit of a, shows you that you've gotten it right and then protects anything else from getting weird as you move things around. The other thing that we're able to do, everything in this test is the same except for this line. So even though I'm not really interested in testing that React has the capability of firing an onChange event when an input changes. That's covered somewhere in React's code test suite. But I do want to know that my component that I'm going to pass this result to is going to get this string, not this whole object. Yeah. So I just want to make sure that when this function is called, it receives this string that I expect, not the whole of it. We can also do snapshot testing with React testing library. It's almost the same. We use the render, that same render function, and we don't have to manually convert it to JSON. It just figures that out when we call it to-match snapshot. That messed me up for a while when I started switching. But it's just one difference here in the syntax from using React test render. So that would prove that they work together, or they work separately. But it doesn't prove that if I put the 2 components together, they're going to work together. So I need an integration test. In this case, I'm using the main app component because that's literally what it does. And this will prove whether or not it works. Sometimes I'll make a dummy class, or now that we have state management and components, functional components, just to wrap this stuff in to pass data around in. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and run everything the way that it works. This app component does what I'm trying to test. I'm deconstructing 2 items from here, container and get by test ID. Now, what container does is you can treat this almost the same as document in the browser. So when I do container.query selector, and I select by a class here, that's the same as doing document.query selector in the browser. And then the other thing that I'm doing here is so once I get it, and that would generate an error if for some reason that component, that element wasn't on the screen, which would be a really great reason for my test to fail. And I just what I'm testing is I know that hi Roy is what I put in as a default for that in my app. So I want to make sure it does the default. Then this is the same as last time. I'm going to fire that event to change it to new value. I'm going to find it again, and I'm just going to make sure that its text content is new value. So that tells me that they work together. One thing that I do want to make sure of is that I have good, clean HTML that's semantic and correct. And the best way to do that is check for accessibility errors. Also, I find out if I have accessibility errors. There are 2 ways to do this that are complementary. They both use DQ acts, which you can also get as a browser extension in other scans. Rachel Cherry gave a talk this morning I watched where she talked a lot about this stuff, doing the manual. And one of the things that she pointed out here is that is that accessibility scanning is great in terms of it tells you whether or not you have issues. It doesn't prove to you that you don't have errors with accessibility. It just shows you whether or not you potentially have problems. So it's a good start, but don't miss usability testing. Just have a user go through this and do it with a screen reader or whatnot. But sorry, I keep jumping around. React Acts, I have a link to how to set this up at the end. This is not really part of testing, it's just a development tool. That'll just show console errors whenever you've created accessibility errors. And then what I am going to show you is Jest Acts, which uses Acts inside of Jest. Oh, this is all backwards. Sorry. I will change this after the thing. But basically, shoot, this is a bad one. But we render the app, and then we expect it to not have violations. The example code has this, and I will update this in there. But I think that's important because I want I don't want to be discriminating against people with disabilities, and I don't want to have bad HTML. So this is going to help me avoid a lot of problems. Just remember, this passes doesn't make you suddenly 100% accessible. Just a good start. So, but my question is, does it display a value? I think that I test pass that. When I have an input and it changes that value, does it change? My test pass that, and then if you go in the demo code and launch that in a browser, it has instructions, you'll see that it does that. So that's cool. So that's the end of my part 1. I have a part 2 where we're going to go through and do basically the same things inside of a Gutenberg block. And there's example code here. Part of the reason why I spent time building that is so I wouldn't have to again. I could just use that as a template because it's got everything set up for the testing and the end-to-end testing and build and stuff. So yeah, please steal. Please borrow using your GPL rights. Second freedom. So if you have a plugin, you can just go ahead and yarn add WordPress scripts to get added in. And so let's imagine that we have a block, and it's going to have that same spec. It has a component for showing the value, and we're going to reuse those. In my example code, I cut and pasted them in along with the unit tests. If I was doing this in production, I would have either used a monorepo to share the two, or I would have pushed the components from the app to NPM and then installed them in. I do both. I'm not really sure which one's better. This is my first time using like MDX for slides, and in hindsight, I should have done a monorepo for all the example code and this. Next time. But I want to make sure that the block, the preview and the render content that goes to WP or to post content, that should be identical HTML. And the control for the value should appear in the block inspector controls. That's my spec. So no unit tests because the components are already unit tested. We just want to make sure will Gutenberg be able to manage our component state. And then our end-to-end tests are going to answer a couple other questions for us. Does our plugin activate without errors? All right, I do plugin development, so one of the things that I do a lot is I still do plugin development. But one of the important things is you install the plugin on a fresh test site and you hit activate, because there's that disappointing screen where it says errors. You really don't want your end users to see that. So this end-to-end test suite will activate the plugin, which is cool because that'll fail early. You have a real problem. And I also want to make sure does it appear in the block chooser. So WordPress scripts I've referred to as this React scripts inspired zero config build tool. It's got like a compiler for all your modern JavaScript stuff. It's got a linter for WordPress coding standards. It has the test runner, it has the end-to-end test suites. It's got some of the local development stuff. Good stuff. So it's setting up a plugin for testing. As I said, we should install that yarn add WordPress scripts. And then in the README, it has these shortcuts to add to the scripts in your package.json. This one here is one that I will get to in a second. This runs a bash script that will start my local development environment. And by my local development environment, I mean the one that I cut and pasted out of core. We'll get to that in a second. So Jest is still the test runner here. So, and you just going to use the same render. Whatever it is that you want to use, you can use it. This is just a shortcut for Jest, Webpack, and Babel. And I don't want to use the word just there because it saves so much time. There's so much complexity that it hides. But it's important not to think of this as some sort of special magic black box. It's just Webpack, Babel. It's not a WordPress thing. It's a WordPress implementation of very standard tools, which is great because if you already know those tools, you can use these. And if you're just learning from this, it's transferable knowledge. I do think that the block structure, the basic tutorials will tell you to go ahead and put it all in like one file. And that's cool for short, simple blocks, but it doesn't scale and it doesn't give us this kind of isolation here. So this is my index.js for my block. And I already started using the RFC for block registration because I can more easily share the title, those sort of things between PHP and JavaScript. And really looking forward to that being something that happens automatic, the registration. So in this case, I have an editor and a save component, which we'll look at in a second. But they're just coming in here, and I'm just mapping the props from edit and save. I'm assuming by 5 o'clock in the Gutenberg track, everybody knows what the rest of this is doing. So let's zoom in here to the edit and save callback. All they do is map properties, right? Gutenberg has a very specific way of working with this stuff, and we just need to make sure that the props go to the right place. I want them in separate files. And so this one's a little bit cut off, and I apologize. Oh, you can see it, I think. But when we look at my props here, these are intentionally what I would expect in a Gutenberg component. But because set attributes could be any function, I'll still be able to swap it out for that jest.fn again, or say React state management. Right? Set attributes and set state in class have a very similar API. It's not a coincidence. One of the ways that you might end up doing testing is putting these inside of a class that has, manages state. We just alias set state to set attributes. So in here, I'm just going ahead and like putting inside of inspector controls that same edit value, and at the bottom, just showing the display. And so this is just mapping. It's creating an unchanged function out of set attributes and getting out of attributes the value. And then I can just test this with the snapshot. And I think in my example code, you will see that I have one test that like checks whether or not it can change. But I kind of trust set attributes at this point, right? Not my responsibility. And then my save callback. Remember, I said that all I want to do is put the same HTML into the post content. So we just do this here. I'll just save this. So that's cool. And then I can snapshot that as well. I am running, I got a little bit of time. I don't want to go too much into end-to-end testing. This could be its own hour, but I do want to cover this and make sure that there's some, more documentation out there on how to do this. Those are some links there that you can do. But what I really like about end-to-end testing is like it lets you test really like the user because you're using a browser like the user. End-to-end testing is included in the WordPress scripts package. An optional step that I strongly recommend is that you install the WordPress end-to-end test utils. So go ahead and do that as well. This gives you a lot of just helper functions like activate plugin, new post, add block, which you could write yourself, but why? So you need to, I didn't show my Jest config earlier because I was just using the default one. But when I was building this, I ran into a problem of that wasn't ignoring my end-to-end test when I was running the unit test, and unit tests weren't ignoring the end test. And so I wanted to show a quick example of how easy it is to override this configuration. Because a Webpack configuration is just a JavaScript object. I can create my own Webpack config, import WordPresses, spread it into a new object where I just change one. These are my test path ignore patterns. These two are actually default. Don't look in Git, don't look in node modules for tests. And then I'm telling my unit test to ignore those in the E2E directory. Those are links to how I have all my Jest set up in the final version. So this uses Puppeteer to automate Chrome. And I think it's easy if you're running Docker locally, like Core does. And again, I don't want to spend all day on Docker Compose, so just copy and paste what I copied and pasted. And we want to test, all we're doing is testing that this block works. We already have unit tests. We already have integration tests. Let's not repeat every single one of those. Let's just do a couple basic things. We're going to start in our test file importing those helper functions. There's a whole bunch of these, and they're all really fun and helpful. I kind of wrote something similar in Cypress, which is an alternative tool for end-to-end testing. Very nice, but I ended up having to write my own helper function activate plugin, and then it was like, oh shoot, WordPress core has a testing library that has activate plugin. So that's cool. Let's use that instead. Let's look at this. Before each one, we're going to activate the plugin. So again, none of this works if the plugin generates errors. And then we're going to tell it create a new post. Then I'll take us to there, and we're going to tell it to insert a block. And then I can just expect I get the edited post content, should have the default state of the block. I'll just commit a snapshot there. No need to get fancy with it or anything. This is, again, an acceptance test. If anything in my code doesn't work correctly, this is going to fail. It's not going to tell me a lot of things, but it's going to tell me where to look. So I'm getting into recommendations real quick before we get to questions. But I do want to recommend end-to-end tests are expensive. And when I say expensive, they're expensive to run in the services to automate them. I like Ghost Inspector a lot, for example. So that's you do like point and click end-to-end test programming. Very neat service for this kind of thing. But it costs me $70 a month, whereas all my other tests, which run faster, I run them for free on Free Travis. And so And when I run them locally, the unit tests run faster than end-to-end tests, right? So I like to stick to covering as much as you can with the less expensive tests. But getting into my recommendations, yes, starting with unit tests on a new project and building up from there is a smart way to go. Build a thing, write a unit test, make it work, write a unit test, make it work, write an integration test with the two things working together. That is great. You have a legacy project with no tests. Lots of people say they can't test their code. It's not testable. All code is testable. It may not be unit testable. You can definitely look at code and say that would be almost impossible to unit test. That would be very difficult to unit test. That would be easy to unit test. So don't start with unit tests if that's true. Acceptance tests will help you get to unit testability safer because you start refactoring so your code is unit testable. And if the acceptance tests fail, well, revert, go back. So it's a good step. You can generally, we go top up, unit test, integration test, acceptance test, but if it's a project that exists without tests, I like to go the other way. Add acceptance tests, then get specific with unit tests. And then at the end, you have both. And I think it should be pretty clear by this point of the doc, neither of them on their own are good enough. You need both. I also want to tell a couple other important things, right? Don't forget about accessibility errors. This post here I mentioned earlier shows you how to set up all of the so it shows you in the browser, and we already showed about how to run the tests. Also, Ken C. Dodds, who I referenced a few times, he's the author of React Testing Library. He used to be a developer relations at PayPal. PayPal used to have this really horrible interface, and it's kind of like big and blocky and beautiful, and a lot of that's built in React, and a lot of the downshift other libraries that came out of there. He sells video courses on Egghead on testing, and I really like his blog on React in general, React testing and accessibility. So definitely use this as your go-to, and then when you get stuck, like Google Ken C. Dodds plus whatever you're stuck on with JavaScript testing. I have a few things out there. This talk is adapted from an unpublished article that'll be on Pantheon's blog soon. So anyway, that comes to the end. Again, you can get the slides and the links from there. I have a blog post at joshpress.net. It's the most recent post that has a few thoughts on this talk and the links again. Caldera Forms is a drag and drop form builder for WordPress that I've been working on for years, super proud of. So check that out at calderaforms.com. It's free to try at wordpress.org. Or you can buy a pro at calderaformspro.com to support what we're doing. I'm on Twitter a lot at Josh412. And I'm going to hand it back to Fabian so he can see if there are any questions, and I will, at me on Twitter or put in a pull request on the code if you have other questions. Thank you.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for doing this. This has been incredible.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
There's one question. You've mentioned a bunch of tools. It seems that every day there's a new library, framework, etc. What's the best way to find, select, learn, master a set of tools that seem to multiply faster than rabbits?
Yeah, so I would say there's this perception that you have to use all the latest and greatest. Right? I had this moment where it was the day that React Hook shipped in 16.8. And I was using them. And of course, I've been using them for months, but I forget what I did. And I was just I don't know anything. How am I so behind? And then I had this moment of the software had shipped that day, Josh. Calm down. You don't have to know all of this stuff. There's no reason to, we saw this in the WordPress days where people were freaking out about Gutenberg. I have to convert everything to Gutenberg. No, you don't. Build new stuff with Gutenberg. If it doesn't work for your own stuff, don't use it. Same thing. I would say find the things that work. Find a few things that solve a practical problem for you and stick to them. Learning new things is difficult. I try to only learn one new thing at a time. And so if you jump in every project with 7 new things, this is always going to be hard. There's literally no way to solve that. And so I like to find the things that work. I was very resistant to go to React Testing Library, even though it clearly was better. It was written by this person who I was reading all of this stuff. I knew how Enzyme worked. And so I waited until it literally failed me.
Any ideas how to be better at adding CI to our workflow?
Yeah, so this is definitely still the pain point, I think, for me. GitHub Actions, I think, are the simplest abstraction, both for like Yarn, NPM, and Composer on the PHP side. There are GitHub Actions where you can just literally type in a command. So I found, because Travis, I use a lot because it's free and it does a lot of things. And then the private repos don't always have GitHub Actions. But I really like GitHub Actions because you can drag and drop them around, and you can just use Composer, Yarn, or NPM and type the same commands. So if you go and look at my code, my scripts in package.json or in composer.json, they have everything. Even if there's like a bash script, I have a Yarn script or a Composer script to run that bash script. And so that way, when I'm working locally, I just keep typing, one-line commands. But when I have my CI/CD, it's just kind of like an overcomplicated bash file that's running this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. And that just removes a lot of the complexity. And then the other thing is I just ask friends how they did it last time. No, that's a really important developer skill, is figuring out which of your friends have the thing you need.
Yeah, thank you again, and bye.